I didn't beg. I want you to know that right from the start. I didn't knock a second time. I didn't call her name through the door. I just stood there on that front step, the one I helped pay for, and I let it sink in. It was October, the kind of October we get in Ontario, where the cold comes in before you're ready for it, where the leaves are still half on the trees but your breath is already showing. I had driven 2 hours from Sudbury. I had a casserole dish in a cloth bag and a card I'd spent 20 minutes picking out at the shoppers on Paris Street. And my daughter wouldn't open the door. That was the day I understood that something had gone very wrong, not just between us, something wrong in her, something I hadn't let myself see. Let me tell you how we got there. My daughter is 34. She was born in November, premature by 6 weeks, and I remember the nurse putting her in my hands and thinking, this is the whole world. Everything I do from now on is for her. I was 28 and newly divorced and working as a registered practical nurse at Health Sciences North, and I thought, if I work hard enough, if I give her enough, she will never feel what I felt growing up. She will never feel like she has to earn love. That was my first mistake, not loving her in a way that had no flaw. Her father left when she was 2, not dramatically. He just slowly stopped being there, stopped answering, eventually moved to Calgary and started over with someone else. He sends a card at Christmas sometimes. She grew up knowing she had one parent who stayed. And I stayed. I worked double shifts when I had to. I took the night float on weekends so I could be home for her school concerts. I packed her lunch until she was in grade 6 and asked me to stop because her friends thought it was embarrassing. I was not a perfect mother. I want to say that clearly. I gave in too often. When she was 17 and wanted to drop dance class, I let her, even though I'd already paid for the year. When she was 22 and dropped out of her second year at Laurentian, I didn't push back the way I should have. I told myself she was finding her path. What I was actually doing was protecting the peace between us, protecting the relationship by never asking anything of it. She met her husband at 27. He was 32, worked in commercial real estate in Toronto, and from the first time she brought him to Sudbury for Thanksgiving, I felt something I couldn't name. He was polite, almost too polite, the kind of polite that's a wall. He never looked me in the eye when he answered a question. He laughed at my daughter's jokes a half-second late, like he was deciding whether they were worth laughing at. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself I was just the small-town mother who didn't fit into her daughter's new life. They got engaged in the spring. My daughter called me and she was so happy, genuinely happy, and I pushed down everything I felt, and I said, I'm so glad, I meant it. I wanted her happy. That part was real. The conversation about the house came about 8 months before the wedding. They were living in a rental in Mississauga, a 2-bedroom on the 14th floor, and they wanted to buy. She called me one evening and she explained it carefully, like she'd rehearsed it. House prices in the GTA were impossible. They were pre-approved, but only if they had a stronger down payment. She'd done the math. If she had $180,000 to put down, the mortgage payments would be manageable on their combined income. She wasn't asking me to give it to her. She was asking if she could borrow it. I had that money. I'd been saving for 20 years, not for anything in particular, for security, for the kind of security my own mother never had. I had just under 240,000 in a TFSA and a GIC that had matured. I had it because I never spent it, because I always thought, what if something goes wrong? What if she needs me? And here she was, needing me. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I drove to Toronto the following month, and I sat with them at their kitchen table, and I transferred $180,000. I watched her eyes fill up. She hugged me so hard I could feel her ribs. Her husband shook my hand and said, "This means everything to us, Shirley. We will take care of you. You will always be welcome in our home. I drove back to Sudbury and I cried most of the way, but not from sadness, from the particular relief of feeling like your sacrifice meant something, like you had done the thing you were supposed to do. The house they bought was in Brampton, a semi-detached on a quiet crescent, 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, a finished basement. She sent me photos the day they got the keys. She was standing in the empty living room with her arms out wide and the biggest smile I've ever seen on her face. I put that photo on my fridge. I looked at it every morning. The wedding was the following June. I was not in the wedding party. She told me early on that she and her husband wanted a small ceremony, immediate family and close friends only, and that she was keeping the bridal party to her 2 best friends from university. I understood. I sat in the third row and I watched my daughter get married, and I thought, look at her. Look at what she's built. I didn't feel proud of myself. I felt proud of her, which is different and better. After the wedding, things changed. Slowly, then all at once, the way those things always happen. The calls got shorter, then less frequent. When I asked if I could come down for a weekend sometime in the fall, she said they were really busy. They were still getting settled, maybe after the holidays. The holidays came, and she spent Christmas with her husband's family in Oakville. She texted me on Christmas morning, a photo of their decorated tree with a string of heart emojis. I told myself it was the first year of marriage. I told myself she was building a new life. I told myself a lot of things. I drove down in October, the October I mentioned at the start, because it was her birthday. I hadn't told her I was coming. She'd been vague about her plans when I asked, said they were probably just doing something quiet, and I thought a surprise will be nice. She loves surprises. She always has. I made her favorite, the chicken and mushroom casserole with the Gruyere on top, the one I've made since she was in high school. I bought a card that said something about daughters and how proud I was, and I meant every word. I rang the doorbell at 11:30 in the morning. I heard voices inside, movement, then nothing, then footsteps. The door opened about 8 inches and she looked at me through the gap. I said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart." I held up the bag. She didn't smile. She stepped slightly to the right, blocking more of the opening, and she said, "Mum, why are you here?" I said, "I wanted to bring you your birthday dinner." I drove down. I thought we could. She cut me off. She said, "This isn't a good time." I looked at her face. I have known that face since before she could speak. I have studied every version of that face. Tired, happy, embarrassed, afraid. What I saw in that moment was none of those things. It was something colder, like she was calculating something. I said, "Is everything okay?" She said, "Everything's fine. We have people here. It's not a good time, Mum." I said, "I don't need to stay long. I could just drop this off and—" She said, "I'll call you later," and she closed the door. I stood on that step for a moment. 1 moment. Then I turned around, walked back to my car, and I put the casserole on the passenger seat, and I sat there for a few minutes without starting the engine. Not crying, just sitting with it. I drove to a Tim Hortons on the main road and I sat in the parking lot and I ate the casserole with a plastic spoon I found in the glove compartment. That was her 34th birthday. She did not call later. Not that evening, not the next day. I sent a text that said, "I hope you had a good birthday." She responded 4 days later with a thumbs up emoji. I want to pause here and tell you something honestly, because I think it matters. I did not immediately think about the money. I want to be clear about that. What I thought about was my daughter standing in that doorway and the way she looked at me like I was an inconvenience, like I was something she'd outgrown. The money came later. The money became important for different reasons. It was 3 weeks after her birthday when my financial advisor called. His name is not important, but he has handled my accounts for 11 years, and he knows me well. He called on the Tuesday afternoon and he said, "Shirley, I need to ask you about something. There's been an inquiry on your file. Someone checked your credit last week. It's not unusual. It could be a routine thing, but I wanted to flag it for you. I said I hadn't applied for anything. I hadn't opened any new accounts. I asked him to look into it. He called back the next morning. He said, "Shirley, I think you should come in." I drove to Sudbury the following morning, and I sat across from him at his desk, and he showed me a document. It was a refinancing application for the house in Brampton. My daughter and her husband had applied to refinance the mortgage. The application listed an additional cosigner. The cosigner was me. There was a signature on the document. The signature was mine, or something that was meant to look like mine. I have signed my name roughly 80,000 times in my life. I was an RPN for 31 years. I have signed medication logs and incident reports and care plans and consent forms. I know my own signature. That was not my signature. My financial advisor said, "I'm obligated to tell you that if this application goes through, you will be financially liable for this mortgage." I said, "I didn't sign that." He said, "I know. That's why I called." I drove home and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I made tea and I didn't drink it. I looked at the photo of my daughter on my fridge, the one in the empty living room, arms wide, huge smile, and I thought about all the ways I had explained away the last year, all the small dismissals I'd absorbed, all the calls I'd made that went to voicemail. I called a lawyer the next morning, a woman I'd been referred to through the hospital, someone who handles civil matters in Sudbury. I told her everything. She listened very carefully, and then she said, "Do you have documentation of the original transfer, the 180,000? I did. I had everything. The bank transfer record, the email chain where my daughter outlined what the money was for, a note I'd asked her to write at the time, a simple IOU just for my own records, which she'd signed and dated. My lawyer said, "This is a problem for them, not for you," and she explained what she was going to do. I want to tell you about the drive to Brampton, because I think it says something. It was a Thursday in November. I left Sudbury at 6 in the morning. I had my lawyer's letter in a folder on the passenger seat. I had my bank records. I had the original transfer receipt and the signed note. I had everything I needed. I drove the whole 4 hours without music, just the highway and the sky getting light and the trees coming back into focus out of the dark. I was not angry. I have thought about that a lot since, because people always expect the anger. What I felt was more like grief, not for the money. I want to say that clearly, because I think people assume this is a story about money, and it isn't. It's a story about a door, about standing on a front step holding a casserole dish and having your daughter look at you like a stranger. The money was just what made everything visible. I pulled onto their crescent at just after 10 in the morning. There was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. I sat in my own car for a moment and I thought, "You don't have to do this softly." She didn't. I rang the doorbell. Her husband answered. He looked at me, and then he looked at the folder in my hands, and something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, more like calculation. He said, "Shirley, this isn't." I said, "I'd like to speak with my daughter." He said, "She's not here." I said, "Then I'll wait." He tried to close the door. I put my hand on the frame, not pushing, just there, and I said, "I have a letter from my lawyer regarding a fraudulent refinancing application made in my name without my knowledge or consent. I'd suggest you call her." He went very still. I said, "I'll be in my car." I sat in the car for 22 minutes. Then the front door opened and my daughter came out in her coat. She walked to the passenger side and she stood there and I rolled down the window. She said, "Mom, it was his idea. I want you to know that. It was his idea, and I didn't know how far it had gone." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about October. I thought about the door. I thought about the 4 days before the thumbs up emoji. I said, "Did you know he did it?" She looked down at the driveway. I said, "Did you know?" She said, "I knew he was going to talk to someone about options." I said, "Options?" She said we were struggling. The mortgage payments we underestimated. He said there had to be a way to restructure, and I thought he meant. I said, "You thought he meant what exactly?" She didn't answer. My lawyer had sent the letter to their bank and to their mortgage broker. The application was flagged and frozen within 48 hours. The bank's fraud division opened a file. My lawyer made clear that I was prepared to pursue the matter fully, unless certain conditions were met. The conditions were simple. The refinancing application was to be formally withdrawn, the fraudulent signature was to be acknowledged, and my daughter and her husband were to execute a formal repayment agreement for the $180,000, structured over time with legal documentation properly registered. Her husband hired his own lawyer. It took 11 weeks. There were several conversations I was not part of, negotiations through our lawyers, a lot of paperwork. At one point, his lawyer tried to argue that my contribution had been a gift. My lawyer produced my daughter's handwritten note, dated and signed, describing it as a loan. That argument ended quickly. In February, we signed an agreement, $5,500 a month, drawn automatically from their account into mine for a period of just over 30 months. There is a lien on the property ensuring the debt is registered. If they sell, I am paid out first. I want to tell you something about my daughter. After the agreement was signed, she called me, not to talk about the documents. Just she called. She said, "I'm sorry, Mom." She said it plainly, without context, without trying to explain it away. Just, "I'm sorry." I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. I said, "I know you are." We've spoken a few times since then, short calls. Careful. There is a distance between us now that wasn't there before, but honestly, I'm not sure that distance is entirely new. I think it was there for years, and the door in October just made it visible. What I know is this: I raised my daughter alone. I worked 31 years, nights and weekends and holidays, and I saved carefully, and when she needed me, I gave her everything I had, without hesitation. And she stood in a doorway on her birthday and looked at me like I didn't belong there. I am 63 years old. I live in Sudbury. I have a good life. I have friends. I have my garden. I have a book club on Thursday evenings that I actually look forward to. I am not defined by this. But I think I spent a long time confusing love with disappearing, confusing sacrifice with worthiness. I thought if I gave enough, I'd earn my place. That's not how it works. I know that now. The first payment came through in March. I looked at it in my banking app on a Saturday morning, standing in my kitchen in my housecoat, and I felt not vindicated, not satisfied, just real, like I had finally stopped pretending that I didn't matter in my own story. I put the photo of her back on the fridge, not because everything is fine, but because she is still my daughter, and because I am 63 years old, and I have learned that holding on to anger is just another way of letting someone else take up space in your life that belongs to you. She is still my daughter. That doesn't change. But I know my own signature. I've thought a lot about what made that October morning possible, not the forged signature. That was the end of a long chain of choices, not the beginning. What made it possible was something much quieter. It was the years I spent believing that if I never asked anything, if I made myself small enough, easy enough, undemanding enough, I would be safe. That my daughter would stay close because I never pushed back. That love, if I gave enough of it, was a kind of insurance. It isn't. I know that now. What I saw in her face at that doorway wasn't cruelty. It was the result of something I had a hand in building, a relationship where my feelings had always been secondary, where my discomfort had always been quietly absorbed, where she had learned over 30 years that there was no real consequence to leaving me out. I had taught her that, not on purpose, but I had taught her. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with, not the fraud. The fraud was her husband's doing and hers for going along with it, and the law sorted that out with documents and signatures and a lien on a property in Brampton. The part that required something from me, some real honesty, was understanding that I had confused generosity with self-erasure. I thought they were the same thing. They are not even close. What I've come to believe on the other side of all of it is that the people who come through hard things with themselves intact are the ones who stay honest, even when honesty is expensive. My daughter's husband made a calculation. He looked at me and decided I was someone who could be taken advantage of, someone who wouldn't fight back, who would absorb it, who had spent a lifetime absorbing things. He wasn't entirely wrong about my history. He was wrong about what I would do when it was finally in front of me in black and white. That's the thing about being 63. You stop having the energy to protect people from the truth of what they've done. Not because you're bitter, I don't feel bitter, genuinely, but because you finally understand that letting people off the hook isn't kindness. It's just a slower kind of harm. I think about the IOU she signed, the one I'd asked her for, almost apologetically, because I didn't want to seem like I didn't trust her. That small, careful act, keeping records, protecting myself just a little, turned out to be the thing that mattered most when everything else fell apart. There's something in that about the difference between hope and preparation. I hoped she would never need to be held to it. I was right to keep it anyway. I am still her mother. That doesn't go away. But I am also a person who worked 31 years and saved carefully and deserves to be treated like she exists. Those two things are not in conflict. They never were. I just spent a very long time acting like they were. She is figuring out what kind of person she wants to be. So am I, still, at 63. I think that's probably the work of a whole life.